Nigeria, 1966. A young nation at the crossroads of history. Just 6 years after gaining independence, the promise of a united, prosperous country stood on fragile ground. What unfolded in the early hours of January 15th would forever alter the course of Africa's most populous nation, not simply as a military takeover, but as the violent eruption of tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of Nigerian society. To understand the seismic events of 1966, we must first understand the Nigeria that existed before the coups, a nation of immense potential divided along ethnic, regional, and religious lines. In the dead of night on January 15th, a group of predominantly Igbo officers, led by the charismatic Major Patrick Chukwuma, Kaduna and Nzeogwu, set in motion what they called Operation Damisa, a plan they believed would rescue Nigeria from the clutches of corruption and mismanagement. Nzeogwu and his collaborators, including Lieutenant Colonel A.M. Murtala Muhammed, were driven by idealism tinged with frustration. Their grievances weren't imagined. They were woven into the fabric of Nigeria's young democracy. The Nigeria of 1966 was a study in contrasts. While political elites amassed wealth and power, ordinary citizens struggled with the unfulfilled promises of independence. Government corruption had become endemic, with public funds routinely disappearing into private coffers. The 1964 federal elections had descended into chaos, with widespread allegations of fraud and intimidation undermining the democratic process. Beneath these political failures ran deeper currents of ethnic rivalry. The Hausa Fulani dominated north, the Igbo majority east, and the Yoruba-led west existed in an uneasy balance of power. Within the military itself, junior officers, particularly those from the eastern region, chafed under what they perceived as northern favoritism in promotions and postings. For these young officers, the successful military takeovers in nearby African nations provided a tempting blueprint. If Ghana's military could seize power to restore order, why not Nigeria's? With this mindset, Nzeogwu and his co-conspirators finalized their plans in late 1965, targeting the political leadership they held responsible for Nigeria's decline. The coup began with military precision. Armed units moved simultaneously against key targets across the country. By dawn, the death toll included some of Nigeria's most prominent leaders. Prime Minister Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, found days later on a roadside, his body partially decomposed. Northern Premier Ahmadu Bello, the Sardana of Sokoto, killed in his residence alongside his wives Western Premier Samuel Akintola, who reportedly fought back against his attackers before being gunned down. Finance Minister Festus Okodi Igbo, dragged from his home and executed. The Minister of Labor, Jel Afolabi, and Minister of Communications Ao Adesoji Afolabi, both killed in the western region. Though Nzeogwu had seized control in the north, the coup had failed to completely succeed in Lagos. Into this power vacuum stepped Major General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi, the highest-ranking military officer and an Igbo man who persuaded the remaining coup plotters to surrender. Ironsi declared himself head of state, suspended the constitution, and dissolved parliament, promising reforms that would never come to fruition. What the coup plotters hadn't anticipated was how their actions would be perceived through the lens of Nigeria's ethnic divisions. Though Nzeogwu himself was of Igbo descent but raised in the north, the pattern of killings, predominantly northern and western leaders, with Igbo politicians largely spared, created a narrative that would prove devastating. This was seen not as a patriotic revolution, but as an Igbo coup. As this perception spread, particularly in the north, the initial support for the coup evaporated. Ironsi's government, already struggling with legitimacy, faced mounting opposition. His decree in May 1966 abolishing Nigeria's federal structure in favor of a unitary state only confirmed northern fears of Igbo domination. The stage was set for a violent backlash. By July, the simmering resentment had reached boiling point. On July 29th, northern officers launched what they called a revenge coup, led by figures including Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, Lieutenant Colonel Murtala Muhammed, Major Theophilus Danjuma, and Major Martin Adamu. The counter-coup was executed with ruthless efficiency. Unlike the January coup, which targeted political leaders, this counter-coup unleashed violence primarily against Igbo officers. The bloodshed began at Abeokuta Barracks and quickly spread across military installations nationwide. The most high-profile victims were Head of State Major General Johnson Aguiyi-Ironsi and his host, Colonel Francis Adekunle Fajuyi, the military governor of the Western region. Both men were abducted during Ironsi's visit to Ibadan, tortured and executed. Their bodies were later found in a nearby forest. Beyond these prominent figures, dozens of Igbo officers were systematically killed in what amounted to a purge of the military's eastern contingent. In the aftermath, Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon, a compromise candidate acceptable to northern officers, emerged as Nigeria's new leader. At just 31 years old, the soft-spoken officer faced the daunting task of holding together a nation rapidly unraveling. The counter-coup unleashed forces beyond the military barracks. Across northern Nigeria, violence erupted against Igbo civilians. Thousands were killed in pogroms that targeted eastern Nigerians living in the north. Markets, homes, and businesses were destroyed as decades of coexistence gave way to ethnic hatred. An estimated 1 million Igbo refugees fled to their ancestral homeland in the east, carrying with them stories of brutality that would make reconciliation all but impossible. While Gowon appealed for unity, Eastern Military Governor Colonel Odumegwu Ojukwu found himself presiding over a traumatized population demanding protection. The military governor, an Oxford-educated officer from a wealthy Igbo family, became increasingly convinced that safety for his people could only be guaranteed through self-determination. Attempts at reconciliation, including the Aburi Conference in Ghana in January 1967, ultimately failed to bridge the widening gulf of mistrust. By May 30th, 1967, Ojukwu took the fateful step of declaring the independent Republic of Biafra, a decision that would lead to one of Africa's bloodiest civil wars. The coups of 1966 represent far more than footnotes in Nigeria's history. They were the violent birth pangs of a nation still struggling to define itself. What began as an idealistic attempt to save Nigeria from corruption instead exposed and exacerbated the fault lines running through the country's social fabric. The echoes of these events continue to reverberate through Nigerian society. The questions raised in 1966 about power sharing between regions, ethnic representation, and national identity remain at the heart of Nigeria's political discourse today. Understanding this pivotal moment provides not just insight into the past, but perhaps a pathway toward a more unified future. In examining these painful chapters, we confront not just what happened, but what might have been, and what still could be.